The rescue boats had already left the beach when the call came to turn back. Nearly 500 Marines were trapped west of the Matanikau River on Guadalcanal, with Japanese fire closing from 3 directions. They had spelled help on a ridge with white undershirts. The boats sent to reach them had plywood hulls, little protection, and only light machine guns. A 22-year-old Coast Guardsman named Douglas Munro volunteered to lead them in. He drove toward the same beach he had just left, then placed his own craft between the guns and the Marines climbing aboard. The rescue would not end when the beach was empty. One last landing craft would still be stuck under fire, and Munro would have to decide whether to turn back again. 7 weeks earlier, American forces had landed on Guadalcanal to seize an unfinished airfield and stop Japan from extending its reach across the South Pacific. The campaign became a struggle for narrow coastlines, jungle ridges, supply routes, and Henderson Field. Large ships could not solve every problem close to shore. Men and cargo still had to move through surf in small landing craft. The amphibious chain was a relay: transports offshore, control crews near the coast, boat pools at Lunga Point, and coxswains who had to find the right strip of sand. Many were Higgins boats, broad, shallow vessels built to run onto a beach, drop troops, pull away, and repeat the work. Their usefulness came from going where larger ships could not. Their weakness was equally clear. A wooden or plywood hull offered almost no shelter from rifles and machine guns. Douglas Albert Munro had not entered the Coast Guard as a famous sailor. Born in Vancouver to American parents, he grew up in South Cle Elum, Washington, graduated from high school in 1937, and attended college for a year. In September 1939, he enlisted in the Coast Guard. He advanced quickly as a signalman, learning the precise work of flags, lights, messages, and ship-to-ship communication. When the Coast Guard began manning Navy transports and their landing craft, Munro asked to transfer from the cutter Spencer to the troop transport Hunter Liggett. He wanted the work taking men from ships to beaches. By the summer of 1942, that choice had carried him into the first American offensive in the Pacific. Munro served around the invasion force as his signal skills were needed from ship to ship. He reached Chilagi during the first landings, then moved to Lunga Point on Guadalcanal with a small Coast Guard and Navy boat detachment. Lunga became a staging point for moving Marines and supplies along the island's coast. The detachment was not an armored rescue unit waiting for a heroic assignment. It was a working boat pool assembled to solve whatever shoreline problem appeared next. Munro worked closely with Petty Officer Ray Evans, his friend and shipmate. The 2 men were known as the Gold Dust Twins because they were often seen together. Their jobs sounded practical rather than dramatic: organize boats, carry troops, bring back wounded men, and keep the water route working. On Guadalcanal, practical work could become a combat mission without warning. On September 27, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller sent 3 companies of the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines west of the Matanikau River. The plan was to land near Point Cruz, move inland, and strike Japanese positions from the west. Munro took charge of a group of landing craft that carried the Marines from Lunga Point to a small cove. A destroyer, USS Monson, fired a covering bombardment. The landing itself met no opposition, and roughly 500 Marines climbed toward a ridge about 500 yards inland. The empty boats pulled away and returned toward the base. For a short time, the operation appeared to have placed the battalion exactly where its commanders wanted it. The picture changed quickly. Japanese forces were stronger than expected and attacked the Marines around the ridge. Their supporting destroyer had to move away when Japanese bombers appeared. Major Ortho Rogers, who commanded the landing party, was killed, and a company commander was wounded. Japanese troops worked behind the American position and threatened the route back to the beach. The Marines were no longer simply attacking west of the river. They were cut off, losing leaders, and being pushed toward a narrow shore where no landing craft waited. Radios and visual signals became uncertain in the jungle and smoke. The distance back to Lunga was short on a map, but the river, enemy positions, and open beach made it unusable as a land escape. The battalion needed the men offshore to understand that the first mission had failed, and a second one had to begin immediately. One small boat had remained near the beach. Ray Evans and Navy coxswain Samuel B. Roberts brought it close to collect wounded Marines. A machine gun burst cut the rudder cable. The crew improvised a repair, but Roberts was hit by enemy fire. Evans jammed the controls at full speed and drove for Lunga Point. With no working way to slow down, the boat struck the beach at about 17 knots. Roberts later died from his wounds and received the Navy Cross. The damaged craft carried a warning more physical than any radio report. The shoreline had become a firing zone, and returning would mean taking lightly built boats directly into it. Above the beach, the trapped Marines used white undershirts to spell help on the ridge. A Marine pilot, Second Lieutenant Dale Leslie, saw the signal from his Dauntless dive bomber and passed the message. The improvised word succeeded where a confused radio picture had failed. It gave the men outside the pocket a visible problem and a location. At Lunga Point, the landing craft were made ready again. Many were the same boats that had delivered the battalion only hours before. Munro had already completed the expected part of his assignment. He knew what had happened to Evans and Roberts. He also knew that the Marines had no other road out. Munro volunteered to lead the rescue and began organizing the return to Point Cruz. The boats could not charge the shoreline as one solid group. Japanese weapons covered the approach from Point Cruz, from ridges the Marines had abandoned, and from positions east of the beach. Munro brought the craft in by small groups, 2 or 3 at a time, so the beach would not become blocked and every boat would not be exposed at once. Bullets struck the water and the thin sides of the craft. Some crewmen were wounded. Munro's boat carried 2 .30 caliber Lewis guns, useful for suppressing a position but far too light to turn the hull into armor. A landing boat offered almost no protected place from which to steer. The coxswain had to see the beach, judge the surf, keep the bow pointed correctly, and remain at the controls while everyone else depended on his movement. Cover came from every available direction. USS Monson returned close enough to fire toward the Japanese positions. Lieutenant Leslie used his Dauntless overhead. Men in the landing craft fired their light guns toward the shore. Each layer could disrupt part of the enemy fire, yet none could clear the beach without also endangering the Marines running down from the ridge. The rescue therefore depended on timing. A few craft entered, loaded as many men as they could, backed away and made room for the next group. Wounded Marines had to be lifted or supported. Rear guards had to fire, move, and then break contact. Every second spent loading made the boats easier targets, but leaving too early meant abandoning men on the beach. If carefully sourced human stories like this are worth keeping alive, subscribe to Frontline Brief, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what you think you would have done when the order came to return to that beach. Munro's answer was not a speech. It was a sequence of movements. Assemble the boats, take the lead, enter the fire, pull men aboard, and go back for another load. The difficult part of courage is often the second decision, made after the first danger is already understood. At Point Cruz, Munro and the boat crews kept making that second decision until the ridge emptied toward the water. As the final groups reached the shore, Japanese troops pressed closer. Munro moved his own boat into the most exposed position and used it as a shield between the enemy fire and the Marines boarding the other craft. His citation later described 2 small guns on his vessel, but the protection came as much from where he placed the hull as from what those guns could fire. The decision converted an ordinary transport into cover without changing a single plate of wood. By drawing attention toward his boat, he gave the heavily loaded craft behind him more room to clear the beach. A coxswain normally maneuvered to preserve his vessel. Munro maneuvered so the vessel would be seen and fired upon. The plan worked. The Marines came off the beach, including 25 wounded men. Boats that had carried an attacking force west now carried survivors back toward the American perimeter. The extraction preserved the battalion as a fighting unit even though the ground operation had failed. The withdrawal was not a victory over the Japanese positions. The battalion had failed to hold the ridge and had lost men, but the larger disaster had been prevented. Nearly 500 Marines who might have been isolated through the night were moving over open water toward friendly lines. Munro had completed the rescue he had volunteered to lead. He could have continued away from Point Cruz with the other loaded boats. Then he saw that the rescue was not complete. One landing craft full of Marines had grounded on a reef near the beach. A boat that could not move was still inside the same field of fire the others had escaped. Munro turned toward it and brought another landing craft to help. Tow lines had to be passed and fixed while the crews remained exposed. A line under strain could snap, a propeller could foul, and a poorly placed pull could drive the grounded hull deeper onto coral. The stuck vessel did not come free immediately. For roughly 20 minutes, the boats worked together under the threat from shore until the grounded craft finally moved. Only then did all three boats begin heading out to sea. That last delay gave Japanese gunners time to set up near Point Cruz. As Munro's boat passed, machine gun fire reached across the water. Ray Evans saw bullets striking close and shouted for Munro to get down. The boat's engine drowned the warning. A round hit Munro at the base of the skull. Evans took the controls and drove back toward Lunga Point. The danger had shifted from the crowded beach to the withdrawal route, but the unarmored steering position had not changed. The young signalman who had survived the approach, the beach, the covering position, and the tow was struck only after the last grounded craft was moving away. Evans ran the boat onto the beach at Lunga Point and turned to his friend. In his later account, Munro regained consciousness long enough to ask one question. Did they get off? Evans told him the Marines had made it. Munro died with the answer. Evans preserved the exchange in testimony given long after Guadalcanal, when there was no surviving battlefield recording to replay. The line has survived through his oral history and Coast Guard records rather than any recording made that day. Its power is not that it sounds written for a film. It is that it returns to the exact problem Munro had been solving from the moment he volunteered. He did not ask what would happen to him. He asked whether the people behind his boat had reached safety. Douglas Munro was 2 weeks short of his 23rd birthday. His Medal of Honor citation credited his leadership, planning, and decision to place his craft between the enemy and the withdrawing Marines. It remains the only Medal of Honor awarded for service in the United States Coast Guard. The award also belonged to a larger rescue. Ray Evans shared the exposed boat and received the Navy Cross. Samuel Roberts died after helping collect wounded men and was also awarded the Navy Cross. The Monson's crew and Leslie's aircraft provided cover. Boat crews entered the same beaten water again and again. Munro's choice made their separate actions work as one evacuation. In May 1943, President Franklin Roosevelt presented the Medal of Honor to Munro's parents, James and Edith. The ceremony placed a national symbol into the hands of two people whose son would never wear it. A few hours later, Edith Munro raised her own hand and joined the Coast Guard Women's Reserve, the SPARS. She was 48 and asked for no special treatment. She went through training, became an officer, and ran Coast Guard barracks in Seattle before leaving the service in 1945. Her decision did not replace her son or soften what his loss had cost. It extended the same idea of service into a different life. When one person could no longer continue, another chose to step forward. Ships, a Coast Guard headquarters building, and annual memorial ceremonies later carried Munro's name. A cutter bearing that name would send new crews to sea decades after the Plywood boats at Point Cruz disappeared. Those honors can make the story feel inevitable, as if the young signalman had always been moving toward a monument. He had not. He was a small-town student who left college, learned signals, requested a transport assignment, and became responsible for landing craft because that was where the service needed him. On September 27, no medal waited on the beach. There was only a failed attack, a word spelled with undershirts, a damaged boat carrying a wounded coxswain, and an urgent need to go back. The lasting image is not of a single man defeating an army. It is of a coxswain positioning a vulnerable boat so other boats could leave. The choice was defensive, practical, and almost brutally simple. Put the hull where the bullets are going. Keep the bow steady. Stay until the men behind you are clear. Then turn back once more because one craft is still grounded. Douglas Munro's final question had already been answered by everything he did before he asked it. Yes, they got off. They got off because he returned to the beach, drew the fire, and refused to call the rescue finished while one boat remained.